Amen. Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Solomon is considering some of the things that he is observing with his eyes. And he's going to make some practical statements in the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 4 that we will see have very good principles for life, not only in the religious realm, but also in everyday living. And he is being a little bit pessimistic, a little bit down here in Ecclesiastes 4, beginning in verse 1. He says, "Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun." Now, he's already talked about that a little bit in Ecclesiastes 3:16. Under the sun, in the place of judgment, what was there? Wickedness. In the place of righteousness, what was there? Iniquity was there. So, sometimes things are the way they should be. And sometimes life isn't fair. Sometimes things are turned around. The values of things are placed upon their head. And so the concept here of there are things going on that just shouldn't be going on. Where righteousness is, there is wickedness, and there is also iniquity and wickedness where there should be judgment. And judgment is where you should expect to be righteousness, right verdicts, right behavior. And so those things that went on then, they go on now. And you see that problem in the days of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 5 and verse 20. God says through the prophet, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And that's what's going on then, and that's going on now. And so he's considering the oppression that's being done under the sun. Sometimes the righteous and the innocent have to suffer at the hands of those who are in power. And that is an unfortunate thing when that happens. Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 1, he says, he considered all the oppression that is done under the sun, and look, the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors, there is power, but they have no comforter. Now, ultimately, they do have a comforter. And who would that be? God, ultimately. But if they don't know that, if they don't have that recognition in them, if they are just looking at things under the sun, some people feel completely alone with no help for them. And they need to be informed that there is help for them. That's what the gospel is all about. That's what teaching them the gospel is so prevalent and so important in their lives, to know that there was one who was willing to go to the cross for you. He cares for you. There is one who died for you. There is one who is willing to be your mediator, your comforter. Who's one who's willing to be your Savior. And people need to know that fact, because there's hopelessness in the world. Despair and hopelessness. That's why many people end their life. That's why people commit suicide. Hopelessness. But they need to know that there is a comforter. And that is God and His Son Jesus Christ and the gospel, and those who would truly love and care for them in the church. And on the side of the oppressors, there is power. Well, we're studying about that in Daniel chapter 7. Sometimes on the side of the oppressors, there is power. But that's short-lived. It's short-lived in the long run. The flower of that grass will wither and die. And it might take decades, it might take centuries. but it will happen. It will happen. Verse 2, Therefore I praise the dead who were already dead, more than the living who are still alive. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. There's that philosophy. That humanistic philosophy, under the sun. The dead are better off. He says even better than that, those who have never existed. Those who have never been born are better off. And do we not see sometimes in biblical history people who have had that philosophy and it's been written down? Didn't Job loathe the day he was born? Job chapter 3. Didn't he say, I wish I'd never been born? Now, he never considered killing himself. But he says, I wish I'd never been born. When he was in the midst of tremendous suffering, physically, with his problems that he had, oppressed by the devil, and everything that he lost, his family, his fortune. He wished he had never been born. He was lamenting the day of his birth. However, he never considered killing himself. He said, if God kills me, I'll trust Him. If God wants to take my life, then I'll trust Him. But he never considered doing it himself. Didn't you also see that with Jeremiah? Didn't Jeremiah lament because of all the problems he was facing, with all the oppression and all the rejection that he was facing as a prophet of God in Judah? He lamented being born. He wished he'd never been born. So there's some times when we can reach that level of despair in our life. And Solomon is looking at that and he said, this is where your mind will go if you consider things done under the sun. When you don't know that there is a comforter, that there is one that can give you that comfort and peace in the midst of your difficulty, your trial, your tribulation. If you don't know that, then you'll despair of life itself. But then he's going to talk about labor and the vanity of labor once again, things he's already touched on in the past. He says in verse 4, Again I saw that for all toil and every skillful work of man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and a grasping for the wind. Envy among those who see others prosper. And so people want to keep up with the Joneses, as that phrase is found in our society. Well, they got a boat. I want a boat like theirs. In fact, I want my boat to be bigger than their boat and have a more horsepower engine than their boat. You know, that whole competition when your focus is on material things under the sun. He says this is vanity and a grasping for the wind. It's a waste of time. Look at verse 5. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Now he's using imagery that you also find within the book of Proverbs. The folding of one's hands in the book of Proverbs indicates what? Laziness. Laziness. Idle hands. They're just lazy. They're not willing to work. Fool folds his hands and is consumed by his own flesh. And that shows how, even biologically speaking, it is not healthy for us to be inactive. It's not healthy for us to be inactive. We need to be working. We have been designed to be active. So he's talking here about the problem of laziness. This fool does this. Look at Proverbs chapter 6. Proverbs chapter 6. We don't want to be found to be sluggards. We don't want to raise our children to be sluggards. The problem in our society is a lot of people are being raised to be sluggards because they're being taught, it's part of a cultural mindset, the government will take care of you. So you don't have to work. Government will take care of you. Well, we're raising a generation of sluggards. You look at verse 6, Proverbs 6 and verse 6, go to the ant, you sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no captain, overseer, or ruler, provides her supplies in the summer and gathers her food in the harvest. How long will you slumber, O sluggard? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. So shall your poverty come on you like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. Laziness, being a sluggard, that is something that is an ungodly concept. In the New Testament, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, and verse 10, Paul says, for even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. Now, this is not talking about someone disabled. This is not talking about someone sick. This is not talking about someone who's injured and can't work. This is talking about laziness. That don't want to work. That person shouldn't be eating. You know the biblical concept, and this is politically incorrect. The biblical concept of what you do with lazy people is you let them starve. That's the biblical concept. People who won't work, they shouldn't be eating. And that's why these people who get all mad about something and say, well, I'm going to go on a hunger strike. I'm not going to eat. Okay. Starve to death then. That's what the Bible teaches. Now, to our society at large who have bought into this hippie love, oh, that's so mean and cruel. That's so mean. We should give in to their demands because they'll starve themselves to death. Well, the Bible says if you don't work, you don't eat. That would solve our welfare problem that we have in our nation if this was implemented across the board. Now, I'm talking about people who have opportunities to work, have the ability to work, but don't have the desire to work, and they don't work, they don't wish to work. And that is something that is, of course, contrary to the will of God. We should be willing to be productive people. Willing to be people who are actively productive. We should be raising our children to be able to get out and find jobs. Teach them the skills that they're able to have to sit down and interview and get a job. And you know, you're not going to go out as a 17-year-old and become the CEO of McDonald's. You got to start by flipping burgers. And if you think that's beneath you to flip burgers, then you have fallen into that desire of not wanting to work. If that's the only thing you can find to flip burgers, then you need to do it. And I'm afraid a lot of parents are raising a lot of dependent kids that don't have the skills to go out and work. And inadvertently, they're teaching them to be lazy. You know, in my generation, and of course my generation wasn't as good as the previous generations, but 16, 17, 18, you're out finding a job. Making some money, sacking groceries, working in the bakery at Albertsons, working in a dry cleaner. That's some of the things I've done. Working in with a welder. There are a lot of life lessons that are learned when you go out there and you find these things. And you have to have the humility to say, okay, I'll mop the floors, I'll clean the bathrooms. And some of those people that did that are now CEOs, making six figures because they were willing to start at the bottom and work their way up. I just heard on the news this morning, it was one of the European nations that are wanting to raise minimum wage to equivalent of, in American dollars, $25 an hour minimum wage. That will be destructive to any society. That's all kind of levels of dumb. But that's what people are demanding. They don't want to start out at the bottom and work their way up. They want to start out where their parents are. Basically, a lot of kids, I want to start out making what my parents made now. Doesn't work that way. I've seen some of those episodes. It's revealing what people will say. It's amazing. Some of them are very humble and very hardworking, and others are just entitled. I deserve this. I deserve that. And that's kind of the prevailing mindset. You can see it on how the nation's voting. I deserve this. I deserve that. And that's destructive to a nation. I mean, it just really is. Any society. So back to Ecclesiastes chapter 4, the folding of the hands, it consumes his own flesh. And he says, better a handful with quietness than both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. What does that mean? What does verse 6 mean? If verse 5 is talking about laziness is self-destructive, what is verse 6 referring to? Right. Right. Overworking for the sake of working, that may be a part of it. Being content with what you have. Paul talked about that in Philippians 4. You be content with what you have. It doesn't mean you can strive to make more money or get a better paying job, but you need to be content with what you have. Do what now? Extremes. 5 would be a lazy person. 6 would be a workaholic. A hard-working person that is both hands full. Exactly. Grasping for the wind, stressing themselves out over, they're working so hard, they're neglecting their family, they're neglecting their children. Some families could live on the husband's income, but the wife wants to work and the children have to go to daycare because they want a higher level of income. They could survive on their husband's income, but because of keeping up with the Joneses, keeping up with everyone's, they don't want to make the sacrifice. And so the children suffer and society suffers as well. It's getting expensive. It is getting expensive. Mm-hmm. Right. See, the whole thing with having kids, part of that is, and here's a word that is just taboo, you sacrifice. You sacrifice for your kids. That means not every one of your family in your immediate family needs a new car. You sacrifice for your kids. Keep your car for 15 years. Right. Right. And that buying a brand new car for someone like that, which that's a judgment call, of course. However, that can develop a sense of entitlement, and they say, "Well, I'll pay your payments, I'll pay your insurance," and then the kid has no responsibilities. And so it creates problems. So he's saying here in verse 6, better a handful with quietness than both hands full. It's better to have just a little bit and have peace. Have that peace. Have that serenity. To have that understanding that God is going to take care of us. Than to be frantically working, both hands full together with toil and grasping for the wind. Look at Proverbs chapter 15, 16 and 17. This kind of ties into it. Proverbs 15, 16 and 17. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure with trouble. Better is a dinner of herbs where love is than a fatted calf with hatred. So the bottom line, materialism doesn't buy happiness. I tell you what, in visiting other countries, you see people there, brethren in third world countries that are happy and content and smiling and having a good time, and they don't have all the things that we have. You see little kids that, from whatever trash they can find, make their own little toys. And they're running around just as happy. They don't have their iPhones and their iPads and something stuck in their ear, and they're walking around like a zombie texting something. And they're just as happy and as content. And the brethren over there in these third world countries are very, very dedicated and committed. Some of them walk several miles to come to worship service in a building that's not as good as one of our barns. And they'll come and sit. Some of them sit on the floor for hours to worship God. And they have that quietness, that quiet contentment. They know this world's not their home. They're just passing through. But we get too at home in this world and we start settling in under the sun. We think this is all there is. We miss the point and the devil has us. Proverbs 16, 26. The person who labors for himself, for his hungry mouth drives him on. What's the other one? Better is a dry morsel with quietness than a house full of feasting with strife. That's good. Let's go along. And there's several in the book of Proverbs that deal with the fact that you're better off with just a little bit, with peace of mind, a right relationship with God, than an abundance of riches and all the strife and the headache and the problems and the unsettled mind that goes with it. Right. I'm not sure where that is either, but that concept, I understand that concept. So when people, you focus on the here and now, and people work just for the material things of this life, and then it's all gone. And then at the end of the life, you have a funeral for them, and what can you say? Well, they worked really hard. That's about all you can say about them. Zero spiritual fiber. They worked really hard. How much did they leave behind? Every single bit of it. Every single bit of it. So what does the Bible tell us to labor for? John chapter 6, Jesus said, you labor for the food that doesn't perish. Spiritual things. Don't labor for the food that perishes. That means don't put your focus on the material, physical things. You labor for the food that doesn't perish. That's the eternal life that the Son of God will give. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 6 and verse 33, seek first the kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. In other words, all the necessities of life will be given to you. You'll be taken care of if you put the kingdom first. Strive to be like Christ, the greatest man who ever walked the earth, who didn't have much. I mean, He didn't even have a burial plot. He was buried in a borrowed tomb. Rich man's tomb. Only thing he had was the clothing on his back that they took from him when they crucified Him. And he was the greatest man who ever walked the face of the earth. So we got to get this focus back on the spiritual and say, I'm going to labor hard for the Lord, realizing I don't deserve heaven, but I'm going to labor hard for the Lord and glorify Him to the best of my ability, because that's my retirement. Revelation 14 and verse 13. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. Now back to verse 7 of Ecclesiastes 4. Solomon says, Then I returned and I saw vanity under the sun. Again, there's that philosophy. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, For whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. One who is alone, and there is no end to all his labors. And the eyes are never satisfied with riches. It's never enough. If you have 10 million, you can get 11 million. And if you have 15 million, you can get 16 million. Never enough. That's just the greed factor. But he never asked this question, of whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? I'm toiling. I'm working hard. I'm alone. I don't have a son nor brother. You know, what good is all this accumulation going to do me? He says this is also vanity and a grave misfortune. Working so hard with no eternal goal in mind. Not looking at the big picture, but only the under the sun picture. Just the here and now. That describes so many in our world today that for their careers and for their money, they'll sacrifice everything. Their marriage, their family, their children. They'll sacrifice everything for their career and never stop to ask themselves, for whom am I doing this? And deprive myself of good. In contrast to the one who is alone, he's going to talk about how there is strength in numbers. Look at verse 9. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, one will lift up his companion, but woe to him who is alone when he falls. For he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. So in contrast to the one who is alone without companion, verse 8, he's going to talk about there is strength in numbers. Two are better than one. You're trying to lift something. Having more than one person to do it is going to help you. This is something that's applicable not only in the material world, but also spiritual. Of course, the spiritual first and foremost. Having someone that you can talk to help you, to edify you. What does James say in James chapter 5? Confess your faults to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. That's why we assemble together. And there's no such thing as being a solo Christian. Because when we isolate ourselves away from other brethren, we're going to fall. And in the world of the physical and everyday life, having two to be on a task is better than one, because they have good reward for their labor. When Jesus sent them out on the limited commission in Matthew chapter 10, how did He send them out? 2 by 2. How many elders are supposed to be in each congregation when men are qualified? At least 2. You can have more, but never one, at least 2. Plurality of elders. Acts chapter 4 and verse 23. The elders, plural, shepherd the church. So a plurality is there that helps. It helps in labor. You're trying to lift something, you're trying to move something, having 2. Verse 10, if one fall, the other can lift you up, but woe to him who is alone when he falls. Again, there's the problem of when you fall, think about that spiritually, you have someone there to help you. Someone to help you get back up, spiritually speaking. But if you're alone when you fall, you have no one to help you. Some people who are disabled because of old age, they can fall in their house, and if they're by themselves, they have no one to pick them up. I mean, quite literally. And so that presents a problem. And so it's better to have someone there to help you. And keeping warm, verse 11, if 2 lie down together, they will keep warm. You benefit from each other's body heat. But how can one be warm alone? If you're alone in a situation and you don't have the proper garments or clothing or shelter to keep you warm, then you could very well die. But if you have someone with you, you could keep warm, feeding off each other's body heat. And then protection. That could be part of the reason why Jesus sent them out 2 by 2 in Matthew chapter 10 in the limited commission. Though one may be overpowered by another, 2 can withstand him. And a 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. And that's why it's smart to have someone with you if you're in a dangerous area. Have someone there to help you, because 2 can withstand him. Protection in numbers. Now, you put your hands together and you put a little twine around it. Can you break it? You can break that cord very easily. But you let that cord be wrapped around your hands over and over and over again. It's going to get so strong that you're not going to be able to break that bond. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. What is a rope but a bunch of little cords intertwined together? That's what gives the rope its strength. You take one of those little small pieces of that rope out, isolate it from the rest of it, you could easily break that. But a rope is intertwined together to give it strength. So there is the concept of strength in numbers. And what did God create at the beginning? Male and female. Created man. What did He say? It's not good that man should be alone. Genesis chapter 2. Created a female companion. So you have that concept of 2 is better than being 1. When a person isolates themselves away to be by themselves, like a hermit, and they get away from everyone, that is fraught with all kinds of problems. First of all, there's a spiritual problem there. There's a spiritual problem. Because assembling together is a command of God. That we assemble together as saints and worship God as a church, as an assembly. So there is that problem. Hebrews 10:25 speaks about that. Also, you fall into all these problems. Have you heard in the news of people that they have found dead that have been dead for weeks or months and no one knew? No one knew. Some of them are sitting there in their recliner and they've died. No one checked on them. All alone. They could have been still alive if someone there could have got medical help for them. But they are there by themselves. And just over time, people, whatever happened to Mr. Smith? I don't know. Let's go by his house. And there he is. Because he's alone. Isolated. So it's fraught with all kinds of problem, all kinds of difficulty to isolate yourself from people. Just on a practical level. A practical level. Very much so, it is true to say living the Christian life is a teamwork, and there's no I in team. We are working together, striving together for the gospel. Then in the remaining verses, he says in verse 13, "Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king. Although he was born poor in his kingdom, I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end to all the people over whom he was made king, yet those who come after him will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and a grasping for the wind." So he's talking about the contrast of a poor and wise youth. That's better than a king, an old king who's foolish and who will be admonished no more, will not listen to anyone. Now, we have to understand in the society of a king, what the king says goes. I mean, there's no vote on the matter. There's no Congress to veto anything the king says. And so, you have an old and foolish king that cannot be admonished, cannot be corrected. That's detrimental to the kingdom. That's a problem for the kingdom. But a poor and wise youth, someone who doesn't have a whole lot, they're poor as far as this world's goods, but they're a wise youth, that's better than a king. Because a wise youth is going to listen to admonition, going to listen to instruction, going to take it to heart and obey it. Do we not see that in the book of Proverbs where Solomon mostly writes and says, "Son, listen to my admonition. Listen to your father. Listen to your mother. Be a wise youth. Avoid these things. Do these things." You find that all throughout the book of Proverbs. And so you see this person who becomes king, verse 16, in this scenario that he gives. And he said there was an end in verse 16. There was no end of all the people over whom he was made king, yet those who come after him will not rejoice in him. This surely also is vanity and a grasping for the wind. You think about people who rose to power from a certain condition, and they are good for a while, then they go bad, and then people cannot rejoice over them once they die. What king comes to mind in that description? King of Israel. Wouldn't it be the first one? Saul? Saul, the son of Kish, of the Benjamites. He became king. Very humble at first. Was hiding among the luggage at first. He stood head and shoulders above everyone else in stature. Very humble. But then he became prideful. Started doing things that were unscriptural. And the kingdom was ripped from him, and in time it would be given to King David. But there was kind of an overlap there when David was rising to power in the kingdom. Then he became jealous of David, tried to kill him, and suffered all kind of mental anguish towards the end of his life, and then eventually committed suicide in battle. I mean, what a tragedy that is. He would not listen to the admonition of Samuel, the prophet, trying to get him to be humble. He said, you were little in your own eyes at first, but then you started growing in pride and arrogance. So we have this admonition here that we need to be wise like a poor, wise youth that's willing to listen than a king that's old and stubborn and set in his ways and will not change. We need to listen to the lessons that we learned from the book of Ecclesiastes and the things that we learn concerning the strength in numbers, how that is detrimental to us to be alone, how that we should be productive and not lazy people, and how that we should put our focus on spiritual things and trust in the promises of God to be with us. Next week, Lord willing, we'll look at Ecclesiastes chapter 5, so be reading and studying that chapter.